Okay, welcome to These Last Days video series, the detailed review of the timeline. The prior video series was the general overview. In this video series, we're going to go and take a look at each one of these events and some of the supporting passages and build the case for both what is the passage trying to tell us the event is and try and get some notion of the ordering of the event. As we'll see in all the upcoming videos in this series, we're not trying to be exhaustive. The charts don't represent all the passages on a topic. It's just enough to describe the event and give it some positioning on the chart and to give us some understanding of what the event is. We also don't have all the events on the chart. The charts aren't exhaustive. If we tried to cover all the events described leading up to and into the last 7 years before the second coming of Christ, we would have to have dozens of slides with much more detail. And the passage references, again, if we tried to be exhaustive, these charts would be black with ink. So what we're trying to do is establish the overall trend, the overall theme, and then as you study the Bible for yourself, or as you look up some of the passages that are referenced, you should be able to see where the events or the passages that you're reading fit on the overall timeline. And that's why these are just great big sweeping reviews of the end times timeline events and not trying in any way to be exhaustive or complete. If some of your friends or somebody you're talking to tells you about something and you don't know where it fits on the timeline, hopefully these timelines are enough for you to go back and review the passages, and you should be able to place those events and those items on the timeline for yourself. Now let's go take a look at some of the scripture passages of probably what's the most famous Bible prophecy in the Bible. A lot of Bible scholars will say it's the most important prophecy in the Bible, and they say that because it introduces both the first coming of Christ as well as the second coming of Christ, and is why we labeled these 3 slides in terms of the 70th week, or Daniel's 70th week, is because it's the passages that include the description of what to expect in the end days, and gives us a basis for why we laid out the timelines as we have. So let's go over to a tool, and there's lots of online tools. I just happen to like to use a tool called Bible Gateway, and Bible Gateway has multiple translations and multiple languages, and that's really useful if you're doing a Bible study, because as we'll see in this brief little passage review, we're going to use more than one version to keep clarity in the passage. Let's come over. I've got a couple of passages open. We'll start with Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. And I'm going to start in the English Standard Version, but we're also going to take a look at a couple of the verses. We're going to look in the King James Version, because what we're looking for is clarity. Bible prophecy sometimes is symbolic. A lot of times the passage is very densely packed with information, and so you compare translations to make sure you understand what's being said. This prophecy, as I said, points to the first coming of Christ and then the second coming of Christ. So let's get into it and see what it's saying. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression and to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint the most holy place. Okay, that's the first verse. Let's just break this down a little bit, and then we'll move into the next verse and then the next verse. So 70 weeks, and you see a little footnote here. If you have a study Bible at home, or if you just put this into Google, you'll see that the common interpretation of this, that word weeks in Hebrew, is really what we would say is a 7, which sounds a little strange. So it's 77s. But for the Jewish people, God gave them uh, a lot of their Hebrew customs surround sevens, and so there's 7 days in a week, with the last day being the Sabbath. There's actually 7 years in the Sabbath for the land and for the soil when they plant and they do harvest, and then there's 7 of those 7-year periods till they get to a big celebration in the 50th year called the Jubilee. And so these cycles of 7 are important. And so one of the challenges with this passage in particular is which kind of 7 are we talking about? We have 77s, and it got translated weeks. Well, these are really weeks where the days within the week are years, and it's left to another Bible study to show and prove that that's the correct interpretation. So we've got 70 weeks of years, and that gives us 490 years. And it's decreed about your people, and Daniel was a Jew, so his people were Jewish, and the holy city, which the holy city to the Jewish people is Jerusalem, to finish transgression, put an end to sin, atone for iniquity, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal both vision and prophet, and anoint the most holy place. So that's a whole bunch of stuff there. But we know not all of it has occurred. Matter of fact, you could argue that not all of this each one of these statements has finished to the end, because to finish the transgression, well, the Jewish people would say it's finished when they're all in their land and living safely. So that hasn't happened. To put an end to sin. Well, we know Jesus died on the cross for all of our sins. But in case of the Jewish people in particular, they typically haven't accepted Jesus' death on the cross for their sins. So their sin continues. To atone for iniquity, same. To bring in everlasting righteousness. Well, that hasn't happened yet. And so these statements you can see are pointing to a broad arch of time. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with square and moat, but in a troubled time. Okay, let's break this down. Know and therefore understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem. So first we need a little historical context. Daniel lived in the 600s and 500s BC, and this passage is in relation to the fact that starting in 605 BC, the Babylonian Empire came and they took Jerusalem, and they put in a sort of a vassal ruler to control Jerusalem, and they took away, over a period of years, they took away the Jewish people out of the land. And so starting in 586 BC, actually the entire nation of Israel had been deported, other than some caretakers of the farms and the fields. And so this passage is being written during a time while the Jews are in their first diaspora. And diaspora is in reference to when a people have left their land or have been pulled from their land. And we'll talk a lot more about diaspora later, but this is significant. So Daniel is sitting over actually in the area of Iraq, and the people are in Iraq and Mesopotamia region, and he gets this vision from the angel Gabriel, and that's the context of the rest of chapter 9 here. And he's getting the vision. He's being told, you've got this 490-year period, and at the end of the 490-year period, basically, we've arrived where there's atoning for iniquity and sin has been finished and all this, which is great. But he's telling us in this passage, specifically in verse 25, when it's going to start. So he's know and therefore understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem, which had been ransacked in 586 BC. So we're looking for a decree to rebuild Jerusalem, to the coming of the anointed one, a prince. And then the passage continues, there'll be 7 weeks, and then for 62 weeks it will be built again with the squares and the motes in troubled times. And so you've got two chunks of time here, and he's marking the decree to go build it, and he's marking the advent of the anointed one arriving, which is very exciting for the Jewish people because they were waiting for the promised Messiah. Now, I think actually verse 25 here is a little bit easier, and maybe verse 26 as well, to deal with in the King James Version. And so one of the things I want to get a little bit used to is being okay with going and taking a peek and what does this look like in a different language, or in a different translation, sorry. All right, so let's pop down to verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, the wall even in troublous times. Now, I personally think that's more clear. One is we see what's going to happen here. There's 7 weeks, and then 62 weeks is 62 weeks. So we've got 69 weeks and a rebuilding of the Jewish city is going to happen in the wall, and also they're going to have at the end of this Messiah the Prince arriving. So I think that's a lot more clear. So as we said just a couple minutes ago, these are weeks of years, and so the first 7 weeks that's mentioned here is really 49 years. And the second 62 weeks is 434 years. So in total, we've got 69 weeks according to this passage, which relates to 483 years. And during that time, we're going to see Jerusalem rebuilt, and we're going to see the arrival of Messiah, the Prince. And I think just an interesting little foreshadowing for Christian believers is when Jesus comes the second time, he's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And when he comes the first time, he's arriving as the Prince, which is just kind of a interesting foreshadowing that he's something on his first coming, and then he's going to be something different on the second coming. And some Jewish believers even thought this in Old Testament times. They looked for 2 different Messiahs, Messiah ben David and Messiah ben Joseph, and one was a suffering sort of a Messiah, and the other one was the ruling Messiah. So they were really close, and let's leave that there and continue on. Verse 26, after 62 weeks, so now he's pointing us after the 62-week period is complete, the Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince, small p, that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. Unto the end of the war desolations are determined. Again, this is a pretty densely packed prophecy, and we're kind of hitting the highlights, but it's a great one, so let's just kind of keep going through here. So they picked this one up after 62 weeks, which was referenced up above. Now it's just interesting that during the very first chunk of time, now the original 7 weeks, that is about the time from the issuing of the decree to build Jerusalem till it was built. And now we got the second part that's being analyzed, that after the 62 weeks, the Messiah is going to be cut off, but not for himself. And that's a clear reference to, Jesus was unjustly put to death on the cross because he didn't have sin. He was doing it as an atonement for everybody else's sin, which I think is great because we're seeing the work of the Messiah here in the Old Testament being written probably some point in the 560s, 570 BC time frame, and we see the atoning sacrifice being hinted at right here. Okay. And then he's going to be cut off, so the death on the cross, and then and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and then unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And so after the 62 weeks, we have the Messiah being cut off, and then we have this statement about "and unto the end," and we're going to have to figure out what that means. War and desolations are determined. Let's go down and hit verse 27 now. "And he shall confirm the covenant with many for a week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured out on the desolate." Okay, so where are we at? We just finished the 69 weeks of the 70 up here, and it ended with the Messiah dying, potentially for the sins of the people, because he didn't die for himself. And then we get this statement about that destruction will occur, and up until the end, war and desolations are determined. So we've got some gap or thing happening here. And then we get this next set of statements, "and he shall confirm the covenant." And Bible study, and again, prophecy tends to be a little bit trickier, so you have to go very specifically line by line and pick these things out. And he, well, which he are we talking about? Well, when you study from a language standpoint and you're trying to determine what's this object of this reference here, you look for something called the antecedent. What was the prior thing being described? So it tells you what's this he in reference to. And if we come up, the prior thing being described is actually this prince with a small p. Now this isn't the Prince Messiah with the big P. This is somebody else being introduced down here, because the Messiah is cut off, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city. Okay, let's use a little reverse logic. We're 2,500 years since these passages have been written, and we know a little bit. We know that the Messiah was cut off, and we know that that the people that come that destroyed the city were actually the Roman Empire. The Roman legions came and destroyed Jerusalem, and particularly destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. And that's giving us the context then of who this prince is. And of the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city. And so it's making a reference to the people of the prince would probably mean that the prince is coming from the Roman Empire. And some Bible scholars will get even more specific than that. They'll say the people that came that destroyed the temple back, now we're talking 70 AD time frame, were actually from the land which was called Assyria with an A, but that we know it today as Syria, and it included and expanded up and include I think the northern portion of Iraq. And so we've got that people group was conscripted as part of the Roman legion that came in and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. And so this prince with a small p that we're looking at is very important. He's coming out of what appears to be the Roman Empire, and some Bible scholars will say even more specifically, he's coming out of the group of people that were conscripted from that area of Syria and northern Iraq. Whew. So a lot there. So that brings us down here, and he shall confirm a covenant with many for a week. Okay, so there's a prince with a small p, and he's coming out of a people that we know as the Roman Empire, and he's going to confirm a covenant with many for a week. And in the context of our study here, we're talking the next week, and so we just moved into then the 70th week that's being described. 69 weeks up here that ended, and then the Messiah was cut off. And then the next event is we see that the city is going to be destroyed, and it did. Jerusalem and the Temple Mount in particular was destroyed in 70 AD by the Roman legions. And then then unto the end, war and desolations are determined. So we have a gap of time that's indicated, and now we've got a prince coming out of the Roman Empire, and he's going to confirm a covenant with many for a week. And so he's going to confirm a covenant, presumably with the Jewish people, for a week or for 7 years. So it's a 7-year covenant or peace treaty. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. So 3.5 years in, he's going to cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. And again, using a little reverse logic, sacrifice and oblation for the Jewish people is performed in the temple. Right now today, in April 2013, there is no Jewish temple. So that tells us that by the midpoint of this last final week, there needs to be a temple sitting on the Temple Mount, and sacrifice and oblation has to be occurring by the priests of the Jews. Okay, and then for the overspreading of the abomination, he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured out upon the desolate. We won't jump back, but this verse 27 is actually a good one to go look at, the English Standard Version or another one of the versions, and it gets a little bit more clear. But it's basically saying that this person, this small p prince that's building this covenant with the Jewish people, and God sees it as an abomination, he's basically God's gonna put an end to that guy in that process, and he's going to pour out his wrath and make that person desolate. And so that's a very important passage. What did all that have to do with end time study? Well, it's basically down here. We know the Messiah was cut off. We know it wasn't for himself. It was for the sins of everybody that puts their faith and trust in him. We know that the city back then, Jerusalem, and the temple back then, right after Jesus died, was destroyed in 70 AD. So this is tracking exactly the way the prophecy says. And then we know that because the Jews were dispersed after 70 AD, that yes, there was there was war and desolation. They were always being picked on in the places where they were sent to. Just think of the Holocaust. Think of all the trouble that was caused under Stalin and the rest. And so yes, there was desolation and until the end. And many people will argue then we're now in the end days, and what we're looking for is this covenant by some person that came out of that Roman Empire to come and make a covenant with the Jewish people for 7 years. So there, now you've got it. You know why we were looking for and titling our slides the 70th week or Daniel's 70th week. It's all to do with this passage. It shows the coming of the Messiah in the first part, and it shows that he's cut off for the sins of people. And then it points to a second time frame, the last 7 years, where a covenant's being created with the Jewish people, and this he that shows up, and almost all Bible scholars say that that is the Antichrist that is doing this. He shows up in the middle of that final 7 years and causes an abomination to the Lord, which the Lord finally puts down. And so people see the second coming then right at the end of this verse 27. Wow. Let's just get a little confirmation of that, and then we'll close out this video and get you into the series. I made one statement in there that that whole passage was really looking at the what Daniel was being told was the determination against the Jewish people for this 490-year time frame. And just to get a little confirmation that that's the context for the tribulation period. Now, it's going to be global in nature, but in terms of God's program, it has a specific meaning for the Jewish people. Okay. Let's go into Jeremiah 30 and verse 4 through 9. And these are the words that the Lord spake concerning Israel and concerning Judah, which back in the day that Jeremiah wrote this, that constituted all of Israel. For thus saith the Lord, we have heard a voice trembling of fear and not of peace. Ask ye now and see whether a man doth travail with child. Wherefore do I see every man with his hands on his loins, as a woman in travail, and all faces turned into paleness. Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. Okay, so let's just cap this set of verses right here. We see something very concerning and troubling, but it's specific also to God's view against Israel. And so he shows them as just being panic struck. And alas, for that day is great, none is like it. And there's other references in the Bible that says the final 7 years is like no other time on earth, in the history of earth. And so again, this passage matches up with other Bible passages for the very end days, as people say. But he shall be saved out of it, and the he in this case is the reference to Israel. For it shall come to pass in that day, saith the Lord of hosts, that I will break his yoke off thy neck, and will burst the bonds, and strangers shall no more serve themselves of him. And so it's talking about now, but God will then save the Jewish people. He won't let them be completely decimated. So that's one more confirmation about the focus of Daniel's 70 weeks. It's a final judgment specifically to the Jewish people, but it's going to be global in scope. A lot of people also say that last 7 years isn't just Daniel's 70th week. They use this terminology, time of Jacob's trouble. And so if you're watching other videos and they say the end times is coming, it's the time of Jacob's trouble, this is where they get that verse. I'm going to end this video hopefully on a positive note. So the other claim that I made in the Daniel's passages was it was a very specific timing, and we talked about 69 weeks and then the coming of the Messiah, and then after the 69 weeks he was going to be killed, but not for himself but for other people. And I made the bold claim that was Jesus, and I think it fits the passage to a T, along with all the other surrounding elements of that passage, like the destruction of Jerusalem, the dispersion of the Jews, and the rest. Let me just point to one other, since this is a Bible prophecy set of videos, let's just point to one other prophecy that's sort of tied to this. Let's go to John 12. And Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, just as it is written, Fear not, daughter of Zion. Behold, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. And why did I pick that verse out? Well, a lot of people that look at that Daniel's 70-week prophecy have been able to go back and compare when the decree was given to rebuild Jerusalem. And we won't look at it, but it actually came in 445 BC, and it's found in Nehemiah chapter 2. And he specifically says, go build Nehemiah, Jerusalem. And the decree is in the 20th year, and it was issued by a king named Artaxerxes Longimanus. And so you can get very specific then, since these 69 weeks of years constituted 483 years. You can calculate then when was the Messiah supposed to come, and specifically it said the Messiah, the Prince, was going to arrive. Well, here we see this passage in John 12, and we see that that basically, fear not, daughter of Zion, behold, the king is coming, sitting on a colt. So there's his introduction. And funny enough, not only is that his introduction, but it matches also what was also predicted by Zechariah. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you, righteous and having salvation. He is humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And so in Zechariah, we see exactly how they were supposed to expect this coming of the king. And in John 12, we see exactly how Jesus did come as the king. Now, why is this important? Well, when Jesus was riding into Jerusalem on the donkey, the Pharisees stopped Jesus and told him, tell your disciples to stop worshiping you as the coming Messiah, which they were. And Jesus said, I can't, because if I told them not to worship, even the stones would cry out. And then Jesus spoke to the Pharisee and said, if you would have known this thy day. Well, how would the Pharisees, how should they have known that this was the day of their Messiah? It points right back to this Daniel 70-week prophecy. The Pharisees were supposed to know the passages and were supposed to be able to interpret what was happening with Jesus riding in on the donkey. And so let's leave it at that, and hallelujah, we learned something about Jesus and his first coming, and we learned something about the timing and the covenants on the second coming. And thanks for watching.